One of the most interesting things about Avatar to me has always been how it tackles its antagonists, with it constantly blurring the line between a one-off adventure of the week type of baddie, an overarching seasonal villain, and of course, the big bad Fire Lord himself looming over the entire story. Outside of like a grand fantasy story with dozens of clashing interests and personal motives, you would expect there to be some side villains along the way and just a big bad at the end. But Avatar just said, yeah, actually no. As soon as book 1, we have the overarching antagonist that is Zuko, who has his own antagonist that is also an antagonist to us in Zhao. On top of that, we also have the smaller scale conflicts with characters like the prison warden, the pirates, or even Jets. And at the very end, there is the big bad Ozai, serving as the primary antagonist for both Aang as well as Zuko. So right off the bat, there are multiple layers, and he really does feel like this unreachable foe with impossible gravitas. And speaking of, let us address the elephant in the room. When I say that he is a looming force, I mean that quite literally, as before Zuko's return home, all the way in book 3, we never actually see his face. Each and every time, he is hidden in the shadows, and his lines are cold and to the point. He doesn't deliver any over-the-top monologues or do anything really, which all adds to the sense of him just being truly untouchable. From a creative standpoint, much like we later see with Ko and being unable to express any emotions, I think the decision to hide his face is to deliberately avoid humanizing him. Humans are inherently social creatures. No matter how socially awkward we may be, we are incredibly fine-tuned to recognize and read faces. And when there's a mismatch between what we expect to see and what we actually see, that is when things get really uncanny. Think Zhu Di's very creepy smile, or again Ko. Your face represents our humanity, and with Ozai, we get none of that. And by the way, I think that is also why we meet Zuko with his face already being scarred. Without even knowing how he was burned, we already see that he has been wounded. So while we are a very long ways off from him joining our side, there is already a very clear empathetic link there. But okay, returning to Ozai, as soon as the series starts, clearly we expect some sort of confrontation with the Fire Nation. And importantly, our only points of reference to what that might even look like are the occasional squabbles with Zuko and Zhao. One of them...
Well, you're just a teenager.
And the other one...
Even in exile, my nephew is more honorable than you.
So, on a purely conceptual level, having seen Aang's Avatar state, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Aang just needs a few training arcs and will be sorted. That is, until we reach the solstice and meet Roku. Not only does a fully realized Avatar explain the true gravity of the situation, but we are also given an explicit deadline along with our first ever glimpse of Ozai. One which, even in Roku's retelling, is just this fiery demon said to be even further empowered by literal celestial events. His power is quite literally out of this world, and there is not a single thing we can do to stop him except face him head on. Our first concrete details of the Fire Lord are not how to beat him, not how to reach him, or who he even is. No, the previous Avatar, who Aang must succeed, just bluntly tells him, if you don't stop him before the comet arrives, not even a full-fledged Avatar would be able to restore balance. Some of the first ever spoken words in the series is of how the Avatar is the only one capable of mastering all the elements and maintaining balance. But now, we are told that this single man can do something as unspeakable as the mass unaliving of Sozin's reign, and even with the power of all the four nations, the Avatar would be helpless to stop him. And the genius thing here is that Ozai's power continues to be built up through Roku. Right after we are explicitly told that the Avatar will not be able to stop him, Roku casually solos the sages, Zhao, and everyone else, implicitly telling us that even this is nothing compared to what Ozai can do. So while we haven't seen Ozai bend, we know that he can bend a whole lot more than this. But we don't stop there, because just a few episodes later, we get another glimpse at Ozai. But this time, it is from a very different perspective, that being Iroh's retelling of Zuko's Agni Kai. We've been told of his impossible strength, so now we get a whole lot more up close and personal, and instead see how he views his children and really the social hierarchy of the Fire Nation. If from Aang's point of view, he is this horrific fiery monster, then from Zuko's, he is just a shadow, forcing him to his knees without ever so much as raising a hand. But most of all, he strikes his helpless son. Ozai is not only impossibly strong, he is also absolutely ruthless. If he will burn his own crying son, his own flesh and blood, for just speaking up for what he believes in, what will he do to the only person who threatens his reign? Even from broader fantasy tropes, very often you'll see the whole father respecting his son for speaking up for what he believes in, even if their own personal opinions oppose one another. The mere act of speaking up is already worthy of respect because it shows that they are confident in their own opinions. That is kind of a quality you would want in your successor, right? On top of that, it is considered very dishonorable to strike a helpless target, even more so when that target has explicitly surrendered. But again, for Ozai, absolutely none of that matters. If anyone or anything challenges him, they will be burned, including his own son. But there's another angle explored even as far back as Book 1. After the siege on the north, we also see him send Azula after them, an idea that the live-action version played with as well, so we'll talk about that in a second. But here, we see that manipulative side of Ozai. He nonchalantly calls his own brother a traitor, his son a failure, and then sends his own daughter after them. This is a Game of Thrones level dysfunctional family, but that's just who Ozai is. He is monstrously strong, he is ruthless, but perhaps the most dangerous part of him is his manipulation. Just from a handful of scenes, he is immediately cemented as the ultimate big bad. And while it may not really seem like that big of a deal, pulling something like this requires extreme confidence in planning. I mean, keep in mind, there was no guarantee that we would ever see a payoff to this. Avatar was not renewed. On top of that, only naturally, the longer you tease something, the more the audience's expectations build. So you already face the impossible challenge of trying to satisfy the headcanons people would have constructed. And don't get me wrong, purely rationally speaking, you absolutely cannot fault a story for the reader/viewer hyping themselves up and then being disappointed. But the thing is, as much as I say you can't do that, that doesn't matter. This isn't science where you must adhere to some strict rules. If the audience is disappointed, they are disappointed. It doesn't matter how quote-unquote valid that is. You must keep those expectations in mind and manage them accordingly. When it comes to media, and just about everything consumer-facing really, perception really is reality. The single closest comparison I can think of, and don't worry I'm not going to spoil anything, is the basement mystery in Attack on Titan. Much like Ozai, it is a core thing established way back in Season 1 that doesn't see a payoff until, coincidentally, a very similar number of episodes. There too, the story faced literal years of fans speculating. So with mysteries like this, you must always remember that there is a good reason why the whole saying about reality never meeting expectations exists. We as people are unfortunately very good at coming up with the most fantastical and impossible things, and then setting ourselves up for disappointments. So when a story manages to stick the landing, well, that is something special indeed. But okay, you may now ask, why have I gone on this whole spiel about keeping Ozai hidden and how it will never happen again, yada yada? Well, it is just a cool sounding title, but that is not actually clickbait. Exhibit A, the live action version of Avatar, revealed Ozai straight away. He wasn't hidden, like, seriously at all. But okay, settle down, Mike and Bryan supposedly left, even though they're still credited, we'll talk about that in a second, but that's apples to oranges. But wait, Your Honor, have the record show that there is also Exhibit B, Braving the Elements podcast with Mike and Bryan.
I think early on we just wanted to have like the intrigue of who is this guy? He was supposed to be the big bad. Aang was never going to face him in the first two books, so we were trying to build that mystery around him and stuff. You know, in retrospect, maybe it would have been interesting to meet him earlier. I don't know.
So, like I said, the fact that he is never actually revealed up until Book 3 is just something you don't see often, for the simple reason of, say it with me now, morally gray villains. One of the most common things you see nowadays, especially after the likes of The Sopranos and Breaking Bad, is everyone trying to write the next Walter White. Everyone wants to have an incredibly bad dude who, despite his twisted acts, the audience can sympathize with. It is always a matter of, if he does something evil, we must understand why he did it. And that right there is the problem, because frankly, most people cannot write a Walter White. The reason why we don't see a lot of Ozais nowadays is because if you want a quote-unquote complex villain, you can hide him for like 90% of the show, right? But not every bad guy needs to have some tragic backstory or justification. Sometimes it's perfectly fine to have a bad guy be just a bad guy because he's bad. Think Dio, Handsome Jack, Morgoth, even Voldemort. For the most part, these are evil dudes just being evil, and that is totally fine. In Avatar's case, we actually already have Zuko as that quote-unquote complex antagonist, with him taking many swings and roundabouts in finding his place in the world. But as far as Ozai goes, he is just bad. While it is obviously incredibly interesting to explore how villains became villains, their insecurities, what makes them tick, etc., this is not the real world where understanding that behavior is like a net positive. This is a fictional setting. Simplicity often makes for just a better story. In the same way that The Lord of the Rings is a story of a battle against evil, Avatar's story is not a political drama. It is the story of restoring balance to the world, and Ozai is the villain in that, plain and simple. I also have a video about this in the context of Korra and how that simplicity can also be very bad, so it's of course not a one-size-fits-all solution. But before we move on to the payoff of this entire thing, I want to briefly return to that point of Mike and Bryan talking about potentially meeting Ozai earlier. Let me put it this way. I don't think it's a coincidence that even after their formal departure from the Netflix series, they are still credited as the writers for the Ozai and Zuko Agni Kai episode. I say that because I think the way it shapes out is a very interesting spin on what we actually saw in the original, and I would not at all be surprised if much of this is their actual vision that I want to very briefly talk about. Throughout the first season, that angle of Ozai pitting Azula against Zuko is played up a ton more. So that narcissistic and manipulative angle of him is really brought to the forefront. For him, they are just pieces on the board to forward his own position, and if it's beneficial, those pieces can also be very easily sacrificed. It's basically the same thing we see in the animation, only there is more of it and it's way more explicit. But by far the biggest thing are of course the changes during the Agni Kai. Like we talked about a second ago, with the animation, that ruthlessness was portrayed through the fact that Zuko never did a thing. The Netflix version, on the other hand, allows Zuko to dodge around and even block a direct blow. But importantly, throughout most of the fights, Ozai is just casually keeping his hand behind his back. This constant toying with him is his very twisted form of teaching Zuko a lesson, one that climaxes with Zuko supposedly finding an opening in Ozai's defense. Apparently, and I genuinely don't know how, some people have interpreted the scene as Zuko actually getting a hit on Ozai. But to me, it was pretty clearly Ozai just waiting to see what Zuko would do exactly because he is still fishing for a successor. He doesn't have some explicit hatred or love for Zuko or Azula, both of them are just tools. The only reason why he quote-unquote cared for Azula is because she was a prodigy, and the only reason he hated Zuko was because he perceived him as weak. So I think with this sequence, in a way, it almost elevates that ruthlessness that was in the original. This is not Ozai just coming to the Agni Kai and striking Zuko if he does nothing. No, all of this is toying with him and trying to teach him this very twisted lesson. And to really cement that, it's not just one blow to punish Zuko for holding back. Rather, he crouches down, explicitly tells him that compassion is weakness, and very slowly burns him while never even flinching. Zuko is his firstborn son, he is supposed to be his heir. So this is him trying to forge him anew one last time. Him later visiting Zuko is not some act of care, just like the animation, it is him just giving Zuko this carrot on a stick just in case he manages to prove useful. So going back to that Mike and Bryan point, it is a very different spin on how to reveal Ozai, but making up for that by showing us just how twisted Ozai is, even with him roasting the bunch of dudes. It removes that monstrous and unknown side of Ozai that we see from Aang's perspective, and instead zeroes in on that cold ruthlessness from Zuko's perspective. Going back to that a face is humanizing angle, the fact that we linger on Ozai as he deforms Zuko says everything you need to know about who he is. A face is fundamentally humanizing, but in this sequence, it is actually dehumanizing Ozai as that same fiery monster. But alright, enough of the live action, let us look back to the OG where our big fire boy has been kept 100% hidden throughout the first two books. And much like the rest of his characterization, his true introduction is another stroke of genius. Like with most of the story, the opening to book 3 often parallels the stories of Zuko and Aang. Where Aang feels the absolute furthest from being the Avatar, just like he did during the storm, Zuko has actually returned home and is being praised as a national hero. But importantly, in the same way that Aang is now masquerading as a part of the Fire Nation, their flag literally looming over him, the theme for the entirety of Zuko's story is also exactly that. He is masquerading as that hero. The dominant feeling on Zuko's side of the story is just plain unease. We know full well that Aang is alive, and we know full well that Azula is setting up Zuko as just the fall guy. Which brings me back to those monstrous depictions of Ozai we had seen thus far. We've now gone from this unreachable fiery monster to Zuko standing at Ozai's door. But nothing about it is in any way triumphant. He is still scared. Even now, Ozai is still a fearful figure. Something that I think is conveyed beautifully by that fiery overlay in the close-up on Zuko. And the absolute greatest parts, as Ozai rises and walks through the flames, the first words out of his mouth as we actually see him are just,
Welcome home.
This is one of those times where direction elevates the episode beyond anything written on paper. Because in any other story, building up this big bad Fire Lord for years, only to reveal him as just some dude would seem kinda pointless, right? But with how the episode unfolds on both sides of the narrative, it is like walking a knife's edge. The music, the constant paralleling to Aang, who flies directly into a Fire Nation blockade, potentially exposing Zuko at this very moment. Everything about this is just plain unsettling. This is supposed to be Zuko's big moment, but it's not. He is right in the clutches of his father, who burned him for the mere act of speaking out. What would happen now if he were to learn that Aang is indeed alive? Personally, I've always thought that the thing that separates a good show from an excellent one is when the direction uses this almost fourth wall-breaky way to manipulate the audience based on their expectations and perceptions. Without getting into massive spoilers, think of the Attack on Titan Season 2 wall reveal. None of that is really story per se, it is rather a very meticulously planned dance with the audience itself. Which is why I also have a 40-minute video about it. Just like we see with Zuko here, it might just be a simple reveal of Ozai's face. There is no grand mystery here, he doesn't have a third eye and he is not some demon. But it is the execution of that quote-unquote simple reveal that makes it so great. This is not just a story as it is written on paper, no. It is taking advantage of the medium itself to plant us as the audience in the same headspace as Zuko and Aang. I think that is also why the whole subverting expectations saying became such a meme. Just like I said, not everyone can write a Walter White, very few people actually know how to manage those expectations in a way that just doesn't feel cheap. Hiding Ozai only to reveal that he is some Giga Chad would be cool, but like, what's the point? Hiding Ozai, building him up as this unreachable foe, and then revealing him not through the protagonist, but through this oddly cold and weirdly unsettling welcoming is a whole nother story. Literally actually, because it is Zuko's story. Avatar is obviously heavily inspired by anime, and with Ozai being the big bad, everything points to him being a villain exclusively for the protagonist. But he's not. Which very nicely leads us onto the raw power of Ozai. I rambled a whole bunch about making Ozai be this fiery devil and how it's that anticipation that colors our perception of his strength. So what do you do once his face is already shown and he is no longer a mysterious shadow man? You could just do Aang vs Ozai and it'd be great. But what you could also do, outside of the very extensive emotional manipulation that is the Day of Black Sun. I think it's quite easy to forget that outside of the finale, we basically don't see Ozai bend at all for the simple reason of building that anticipation. And big surprise, the only times we actually see him bend is against Zuko. I think their confrontation during the eclipse is basically the perfect encapsulation of everything we've been talking about thus far. Only this time, the series briefly tips the balance in Zuko's favor to really show us that ruthless and almost reckless side of Ozai that we only got glimpses of with their Agni Kai. Right away, we see the confidence and almost snarkiness of Ozai as he immediately dismisses his guards, jesting that this truth during the eclipse is bound to be interesting. And to immediately showcase that, as Zuko reveals that he was not the one to bring down the Avatar, Ozai's response is a very calm,
Why would she lie to me about that?
Keep in mind that for Azula, setting up Zuko as the supposed hero who brought down the Avatar is a win-win for her. If Aang is truly dead, it actually doesn't matter. Clearly Ozai favors her as she is the one who almost single-handedly conquered Ba Sing Se, and again, based on his totally calm reaction, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Ozai always suspected that the final blow was also Azula. And the most convenient part for Azula, if Aang were to survive, Ozai already considers Zuko a failure, so he'd be far more willing to accept that it had indeed been Zuko who once again failed. And that is once again demonstrated beautifully with the following scene.
Because the Avatar's not dead. He survived.
What? Get out! Get out of my sight right now if you know what's good for you.
For the first time in the series, we see that the all-knowing and almighty Fire Nation were actually entirely duped. And that's not even mentioning the fact that this too is mirrored on Aang's side, as their entire invasion is completely lost. More on that in a second. The greatest thing about the rest of this conversation is how it shows us the many different sides of Ozai. We've now seen him genuinely caught off guard, but we also see him very quickly compose himself and let Zuko speak his mind, only butting in with his remarks when Zuko insults his or the Fire Nation's supposed pride. I think that is best showcased by him saying, "Oh, you must have learned a lot from your uncle," only to grow very, very annoyed when Zuko says that, "Yes, I did. Those are Iroh's teachings, not yours." Just like their Agni Kai, all of this is a matter of pride. Even if he doesn't care at all for Zuko on a personal level and he's just a tool, implying that his brother is a better teacher than him just hits a nerve for Ozai. I mean, this is a dude who came up with a new title for himself just because. But as Zuko turns to leave, saying that it's not his destiny to fight Ozai, he pulls the ace up his sleeve and mentions his mom. So again, that very manipulative angle. And suddenly, we've gone from this intense but simple confrontation to that same fear and unease of Zuko's return at the start of Book 3. Suddenly, the board is flipped completely upside down and Ozai is once again in complete control. Once again, the direction plants us directly in the shoes of Zuko as we are just captivated by Ozai's monologue, only to get completely blindsided about why he baited him into staying in the first place. Even very visually, the camera punches closer and closer. From the room, to Zuko beginning to cry, to a close-up of Ozai's face. Those almost claustrophobic shots are pushing us further and further until suddenly, we fade back to the sun. If thus far the series had been extremely coy about Ozai's bending, then here he literally dual wields lightning bolts with the tiniest fraction of the sun peeking through. This is but a glimpse at his true power, and he uses it against his own son. This is Fire Lord Ozai, a ruthless bender with power absolutely eclipsing Azula and even Iroh. Keep in mind that Ozai thinks Zuko is weak, he doesn't know of any lightning redirection techniques, and he outclasses Zuko in every sense of the word. But even so, he goes right for lightning. The most deadly and way overkill technique imaginable because Zuko hurt his pride. And very visually, Zuko redirects that cold and ruthless blow. He is not a killer like his father, and he rejects the power that is lightning. As we've learned, lightning redirection takes an immense amount of self-control and confidence. One wrong move and he could be dead. But with almost no practice, he still doesn't just unleash it randomly. No, he shoots it not at Ozai, but right next to him, sending the Fire Nation flag falling to the floor. And that is when we see Ozai's true face and his true rage. His failure of a son rejected him, disrespected him, and somehow even resisted a power that should just not be resistible. He revels in raw strength and superiority. That is why he names himself Phoenix King. He views himself as the chosen one to end this war, to transcend the nations themselves, and to surpass even Sozin for whom the comet was named. He wants to rewrite history with him alone at the very top, and if the world needs to burn in order to achieve that, so be it. He is a byproduct of the ever-tightening grip that is the war machine started by Sozin, one that, after 100 long years of war, now faces its biggest and potentially final challenge. He no longer cares for successors. With the blessing that is the comet, it is all or nothing. That is who Aang must now face, the Fire Lord, the Phoenix King, with little to no knowledge of how to firebend, and the fear that stems from burning Katara. He must now face fire, the element that consumes all, be it Katara or the entire world. The most beautiful and often overlooked thing about Avatar is that it is so much more than the sum of its parts. Much of Avatar's storytelling relies on themes and ideas that are then interwoven into multiple perspective characters, most often of course Aang and Zuko. The storm is a very literal storm, but it is also a metaphorical one, the fear of being lost in the storm that is life and destiny. Something we explore through two directly opposing sides. The Day of Black Sun, it is a crushing defeat for the invasion, but it is also the greatest triumph. While it might not have been Team Avatar facing Ozai, the first shot of this final battle is actually Zuko. He is the one who brings down the Fire Nation flag, and he is the one to announce that the Avatar has returned yet again. What I'm getting at is that Ozai isn't just a great villain because we don't see him until book 3. He's not just scary because he is so much stronger and infinitely more ruthless than anyone else in the series. He is all of those things and more because of the familial and antagonistic themes we explore through both Zuko and Aang. He is the manipulative father who Zuko desperately wanted to impress, but he is also the single person threatening to essentially destroy the world. Avatar is not One Piece, where keeping someone hidden for literally hundreds of chapters is basically a form of world building. Avatar is a short and closed narrative. Keeping Ozai hidden for most of it and just unveiling him in book 3 shows a very great amount of confidence that he will not be a disappointment even with so little explicit screen time. To be totally honest with you, I do think that if the series came out today, perceptions around Ozai would be different, and maybe more people would say that he is too simplistic when compared to even Azula, for example. Like I said, so much of storytelling nowadays has shifted to this always morally grey, complex, layers and layers of backstory type of writing that I think a whole lot of people just can't see the forest for the trees, sometimes myself included. The reason why I don't think we see a lot of Ozais nowadays is because he is simple, but it's the story and the world that he exists in that are complex. He is just an evil dude. But what makes him interesting are the countless themes of betrayal, trust, hurt, growth, decay, and transformation that we explore to face said great evil. In the race to make everything morally grey, the story itself can also very easily become just grey. And grey is a very good color, one of my favorites actually, but it is not a terribly exciting one. Ozai is not someone you can just copy-paste into any story and have it be the greatest thing ever. No, not at all. But I think in the hands of an artist, sometimes instead of making everything grey, leveraging that contrast that is just a black and white straightforward villain makes for some of the most interesting stories, not of evil, but of good and of peace. And that's the video. Springtime is usually Avatar rewatch time for me anyway, but the live-action version has sped that up a little bit. So I think you can expect plenty more very soon, especially now that we know that the entire story is happening in live-action as well. Also, side notes, there are rumors flying around that the adult Aang movie might have been pushed back to 2026, and the animated next Avatar series is actually happening in 2025. So whatever the case, there is plenty more stuff to look forward to as well. Basically, we are eating real good. But anyway, with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. And let's also give a warm welcome to the newest member of the team, Yannick or Janik Beaudrau Perron. I am so sorry if I butchered the name, I definitely did. But without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my rambling, so seriously, thank you. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching, I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.